we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know. Because I'd been through the Pentagon right after 9/11. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq."
Immanuel Kant says, you shouldn't ask rhetorical questions about history. We can see the neoconservatives' pivotal role in hijacking the Gulf War for a Middle East redesign project, with U.S. forces currently present in Iraq and 30% of Syria being declared an autonomous region controlled by the PKK. 20 years ago, the 6-day-long Battle of Baghdad started. 30 days later, then U.S. President George W. Bush declared the end of combat operations in his mission accomplished speech and promised the United States military forces would leave Iraq. Today, U.S. forces still remain in Iraq, and with the assurances of incumbent Prime Minister Mohammed Sudani, they are likely to stay for a long time to come. They were there not to prevent the mass destruction that former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was promising with his nuclear and chemical weapons, as then President Bush and the UK Premier Tony Blair claimed. They invaded Iraq to launch the Wilsonian plan to redesign the Middle East.
And there's more that keep walking by, and one of them has a weapon. Roger, receive, target. Okay. 208.
Faced with economic difficulties in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, ousted Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, an oil-rich country on Iraq's southern border, in August 1990, and U.S. President George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, fearing Saddam would attack Saudi Arabia or Israel, assembled a multinational coalition and with the blessings of the UN.
Stay firm. And open the courtyard. Yeah, roger. I just estimated there's about 20 of them. There's one, yeah. Oh, yeah. I got it at 6-1, or correct, Banner's 1-4, Route 3-3. I don't know, that's
Security Council swiftly evicted Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The UN established a peacekeeping force in a demilitarized zone between Kuwait and Iraq. The US, Britain and France committed soldiers, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates provided financial support, and the last Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's Russia morally backing the operation liberated Kuwait, and stopped Saddam's bombing Israel and secured the free flow of oil.
Relevant, copy White 6. That's a weapon. Yeah. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. We'll call for exchange by Charlie Mike Bravo. Speed 37.
If Kuwait did not account for 20%, and Saudi Arabia another 26%, of the world's oil supply, would these countries bat an eyelash after Saddam's Kuwait invasion? As Immanuel Kant says, you shouldn't ask rhetorical questions about history. But more than a decade later, the younger Bush, claiming that Saddam had infringed the UN peacekeeping resolution obstructing diplomacy and implementing brutal internal politics, decided to put together another international coalition. End of history? Remember, in those 10 years since the Gulf War, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama had announced that history had ended, and liberal democracy was going to be a permanent regime in the world. Russia was freed from communism. The incumbent US had more urgent business, like having affairs in the Oval Office. So the world was paying little attention to what kind of policy team the new President Bush had gathered around him until he declared that the US had to invade Iraq, and the world yet again to help them. That Saddam's presence was a slap in the face of the global jubilation of the liberal democracy, and that he might be back in the old game of invading neighbors, or that he was irritating the Shiite or Kurdish minorities in his country, were not convincing enough. Bush could get help only from the British, Australia, and Poland. Despite the fact that this time the UN was not willing to sanction the US invasion, Bush had started the invasion with 130,000 US troops and about 45,000 British soldiers, in addition to 2,000 soldiers from Australia and 194 Polish soldiers. Even though John O'Sullivan, a senior fellow at the National Review Institute and an editor-at-large of National Review, rejects the argument that the Iraq War was a neoconservative hijacking of foreign policy, he accepts that such neoconservatives as Robert Kagan and Paul Wolfowitz were in a position to play a distinctive part in the debate. The neoconservatives had energy, expertise, standing in the foreign policy establishment, and a fully thought-out theory of what they could and would achieve, Sullivan writes. Who were they? And what were they trying to achieve?
Traffic 260. Come on, fire! Hey, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot.
Bushmaster 2-6, Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now.
Alright, we just engaged all 8 individuals. Yeah, we got 2 birds. We're still firing. Roger. Got him.
6 is a 2-6. We'll move, but we got 13.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
bypass.
God damn it, Kyle. Alright. I hit him by heck. Alright, you're clear. Alright, I'm just trying to...
First term of Bush, incubation period of neocon. Bush's first term should be remembered as the incubation period of neoconservatism in the US. It began during the 1960s among Democrats and other liberals, who rejected the pacifist foreign policy of the Democratic Party. Still, prominent doves-turned-hawks found the fertile soil when Bush the son ended up at the White House with no idea about what to do. He got elected running on his father's coattails. He himself was a good-for-nothing, as the Washington Post had called, a SOSO student but a campus mover.
Flying targets again.
Bushmaster 6, this is Bushmaster 2-6.
Got a bunch of bodies laying there. Alright, we got about 8 individuals. Yeah, we got one guy crawling around down there, but yeah, we definitely got some. We're shooting some more. Better. Hey, you shoot, I'll talk. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
He included Paul Wolfowitz, Elliot Abrams, Richard Pearl and Paul Bremer in his Foreign Relations and Defense Policy Administration who, during the first 4 years, created a president who was now believing that he was the reincarnation of President Woodrow Wilson to correct the mistakes the British and French had done after the 2 world wars. As Wilson fancied, but failed to realize, redrawing the Middle East map, Bush had begun thinking that the people in 4 countries were waiting gratefully for American cowboys to spread democracy. The beginning point could be Iraq since there were US forces and pro-US groups like some Kurdish tribes in the country. Constructing liberal global governance and spreading democracy could start there. Besides, Bush the father had already destroyed the Ba'ath Party's balance of power among the ethnic groups and the country was ready to be dismembered, with a little push. In neighboring Turkey, the PKK terrorist group was an example of those Kurds who were waiting to be assisted by the US. They were also influential in Syria. However, there were 2 problems. Turkey was an ally, and Syria had a strong Ba'ath Party structure of power in place. But when you are on a war or revolution path, you can always have opportunities. It'll be all right on the night. The unemployed Taliban Mujahideen in Afghanistan could always come to the rescue. First on September 11, 2001, and later in 2014 in Syria. Meanwhile, the Arab Spring and the Libyan Civil War in 2010 provided many nights that neocons could make it up as they go along. Please fast forward to today. You'll appreciate how much the neocon cahoot has achieved since then. Not only in Iraq there are American forces, but also 30% of Syria has been declared an autonomous area run by the PKK terrorist group. This is the brief history of the Gulf War, as hijacked into a redesign project of the Middle East. 3 presidents and 2 decades later, the White House foreign and defense policies are run by 2 comrades of Robert Kagan, Victoria Jane Nuland, his wife, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony John Blinken, his co-author of books and articles. No wonder, 20 years later the Gulf War still rages on.